All right. Want to welcome everyone to the NRB Live at Lunch. This is going to be a series of conversations we are going to try to have once a month here at the NRB Association. If you're not familiar with NRB, we are an association of Christian communicators, and we exist to equip and advocate and encourage anybody in Christian media. And we're excited about this. Today, our first Live at Lunch is with Dr. Mark Jobe, president of the Moody Bible Institute. He's also pastor of New Life Church in Chicago. He's the author of several books. We're grateful for him to join us. Before we start our conversation, I just want to make you aware of a few housekeeping items, a few announcements. We're going to have a conversation here, and then we'd love for you to have questions. If you have any questions, to put them in the chat box, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. Also, we want to encourage you to be making your plans for the Nrb Convention in June. This is June 21st to the 25th in Dallas, Texas, at the Gaylord Texan. We're very excited about this. As you know, we moved the convention from March to June because of COVID, but we feel really good about June. A lot of people are excited. We have a great lineup of speakers to equip us on a range of communication issues, ranging from some of the concerns people have with big tech and censorship, all the way to talking about, excellence in radio and TV and digital and church media and film. And one of our guests will be Dr. Mark Jobe. And so we're glad that he's decided to join us for NRB Convention, the 21st and the 25th. You can register now, and actually this is the early bird phase, so you can save $200 if you register in this season here. I want to start our conversation with Dr. Mark Jobe. There's a range of questions we can ask, but the theme really today is about crisis leadership. And I haven't talked to any leader of any evangelical organization or pastor of a church who has not told me that 2020 was the most difficult year of their leadership. Dr. Jobe, I'm sure that's kind of the case for you as you're leading a church, but also leading Moody Bible Institute.
It has been a fun year, Daniel. I was with my son who just turned 22 years old, my middle son, and we were reminiscing that in January of last year, he turned 21. So I took him to New York City to get away and just to spend a couple days together with them. Little did we know that in February, a pandemic would sort of explode on the global scene. And we were talking about how much the world has changed in the last 12 months. And everybody has felt the crisis. A global pandemic that caused us to have to wear masks and not things to close down led to 40 million people applying for unemployment in the United States of America. So this economic crash happens. It leads to a lot of social unrest, racial tensions. We've seen it really strong in Chicago. And then a very volatile political environment that has really sucked ministries, churches, and our nation into its vortex. So this has been a year of crisis.
Yeah, it really has. And I wanted to ask you on a couple of levels. I mean, people will say, good people say that leaders are born for crisis, right? And then, leading in crisis is what this is what we sign up for. I want to first talk to you on the pastoral level, because I know we have pastors watching. We have churches that are members of NRB. This has been a difficult year for pastors. And you obviously, like most pastors, had to quickly pivot. You had plans for 2020. You had to change all your plans and pivot. Talk to us about what leaders should think through when they are going through a crisis like this and having to pivot everything that they're doing and change up their vision and their kind of direction What are some things that have helped guide you as a pastor with your churches?
That's a good question, Daniel. So I believe that more than ever, a leader's responsibility is to, first of all, to help describe and help define reality. Max Dupree, I believe, is the one that I first heard say that the first responsibility of a leader is to define reality. And by that, I mean that people in crisis start to define their own narrative. They start to describe their own story. And the pendulum swings all over the place from, find a bunker because it's the end of times to, oh, this is not a big deal. And so I do think that it's the responsibility of a leader for their organization, for their congregation, to be the one that starts to define what is real, what is not real, what is our posture as we face this crisis. And your leadership team and your congregation will take cues from the reality that you help define. And if you don't do that, a lot of other people are going to do it in some crazy ways. When this pandemic first hit, I took some of our key pastors, and we're a multi-site church, so we meet at 27 different locations and about 7,000 people. And so I took some of our key pastors in a room as we talked about this, and I said, I've never been through a pandemic, but I've been through crisis before. I remember 9/11, and as a pastor having to navigate through that. I remember 2008, the economic collapse, and having to navigate through that. In Chicago, we've been through some mega seasons of violence and disruption. And so I said to that team, I've never been through a pandemic, but this feels eerily familiar. So I got a whiteboard and I drew a peak, like a mountain, and then down on the other side. And I said, right now, I know we don't see it, but right now, people are anxious, fearful, lonely because we're heading into a major pandemic. This will peak out and there'll be a new normal. And as things start to settle down, it'll start to de-escalate people's sense of anxiety. We have a great opportunity from now until the peak to not hibernate, cluster, focus on. We have a great opportunity to minister to people. So between now and the peak, let's ask ourselves, how can we maximize an opportunity to minister to people that are full of fear and anxiety? Because we will not have, things will settle down. People will get back to normal. And so that's what we did. For us in Chicago, it led us to, obviously, Chicago was very, very strong about closing down buildings. And so no one was able to meet in their facilities. But there was a huge unemployment problem. So there was a food shortage. And for us, it led to rolling up our sleeves and getting involved in food distribution, mobilizing volunteers. And so we ended up in 7 different locations, partnering with a food distribution center. And every weekend we were distributing food to between 25 to 30,000 people. It struck me, Daniel, as I was complaining a little bit about our building being closed on a Sunday, because we went online, of course, like everybody else. But normally at the location that I'm at, we have about 1,700 people attend on a Sunday. That Saturday, as I was carrying some boxes for this little grandmother that couldn't speak English, food boxes, it struck me that Saturday, we actually fed 4,000 people in the parking lot, double the number of people that we normally would have in our church service, and most of them non-believers, who never go to church. And so crisis accelerates change. but it also creates unexpected opportunities.
That's a great just testimony of being able to say, okay, we can't meet, we can't do our normal church programming and our church activities, but how can we serve our community and perhaps a powerful gospel witness to Chicago in that way. I want to talk about you're pastor of New Life Church, but you're president of Moody Bible Institute, which has a lot of ministries, publishing, higher education, radio, your vast radio network, and many other things. The pandemic also affected your institution, Moody, as well as it has affected a lot of our member institutions, particularly that are doing media. Many of those on this call lead those kinds of institutions. So maybe talk about how it affected radio and publishing and Moody Bible Institute with your students and higher education. And what are some of the ways that you had to pivot in your leadership when the pandemic hit?
Daniel, the word that I use is disruptive. It has been at every level incredibly disruptive. And yeah, as you mentioned, Moody is both the college and the seminary in downtown Chicago and in Michigan, and then an aviation school in Spokane. But it's also Moody Radio, which broadcasts a lot of different parts of the country, and then Moody Publishing. Each one of those was hit in a different sort of way. Obviously, the school, we had to go online. And so there was a massive learning curve for all of our professors. Some of the faculty, great people, but had resisted online learning. You know, what we couldn't do in 6 years, boy, we got done in 3 weeks because it was a crash course on do or die. So it accelerated. What I look at it, it was disruptive and it accelerated. And I think in crisis, again, leaders have to define the reality. And so we had to pivot. That was a massive amount of work that we had to do. I think during crisis, I think leaders have to communicate more than they normally do. They have to reshift their priorities for survival, not losing sight of the long term, but there's a need to communicate confidence. We put together a task force team that was meeting every day for about an hour and a half to deal with the school, the radio, remote working, business continuity. And this task force was a broad spectrum of radio, higher education, publishing, and the task force still meets now, not every day, but still meets now, sort of working through the ongoing communication, because in the middle of crisis, people are asking a lot of questions. How, when, why, can I, what are we doing? And so I think it's a leader's responsibility to over-communicate, to first of all, empathize with people that are struggling. You know, I know 9 people that died of COVID-related illnesses. And so you first of all acknowledge pain, empathy. This is difficult. There's a lot of human suffering involved in this, a lot of anxiety. Leaders define reality, and they have to speak into the fact that, yes, this is disruptive, but the world isn't over. We're going to pull together. We can make this, and this is how we're going to make it. And our teams are coming together to over-communicate about this. And towards the beginning of the pandemic, one of the Bible stories that came to my mind as a template for this was the story of Joseph. We had just finished developing our 2030 vision at Moody. And so we had, we were working through doubling our impact, big vision, and then suddenly COVID hits and we're all scrambling. It's hard to think about the future when you're just trying to survive in the present. But what struck me was the story of Joseph. If you remember, Joseph is, at 17, he gets a God-given dream but he doesn't really know how to handle the dream. I don't think his legs of maturity are fully developed. And so he basically has a great dream, but God gives him a gift. And the gift that God gives him is crisis. And for the next 15 years, he's a slave. He's in Potiphar's house. He's learning administration, management, hard work. Then he goes to prison. And in that crisis, he's learning interpretation of dreams. And God uses crisis to shape him, change him, and prepare him for his ultimate calling, which was to influence the nation and all of his people and Egypt as well. But God gave him he had a dream, and it seemed like crisis was the death of the dream, but actually crisis was the training ground for his dream. And I think if leaders kind of grasp that imagery, that this crisis, although disruptive, could be one of the greatest gifts that God gave you, because it causes you to rethink how we do things. It accelerates us into the future. And in Joseph's case, it prepared him. And so when I talked to our leaders, I said, I believe that this will be difficult, but we're taking on sort of a mentality of a Joseph. God, you are putting tools in our tool belt during this crisis that you will be using in the future to accomplish our mission and our vision.
Yeah, that's really good wisdom. Just, seeing this as an opportunity for what God may be doing for growth, for change, for disruption, as you mentioned, which I'm sure a lot of our members have had to think through too. I want to ask you, we're obviously almost a year into this pandemic. It looks like we have some hope around the horizon. And yet, I'm curious, as you look back, a year is a pretty long sample size. Are there things that you learned this year that you didn't realize? Are there things that surprised you in your leadership? Are there things that are takeaways that you're drawing from?
Yeah, it's been incredibly intense year of learning. And here's a couple of things that we've learned, and I want to encourage our listeners with these things. I think in crisis, we learned that we need to be able to pivot quickly and minister to the needs at hand. For example, we restructured our programming, our radio programming, and so all of our radio programming, basically our talk show hosts, all that happens, we pivoted back and we said, right now the big issue is people are suffering with fear, anxiety, loneliness, depression. So we have an opportunity to minister to people. So we pivoted our programming around faith over fear. And we had a lot of this laid out months in advance, a lot of plans, but we pivoted everything to deal with faith over fear. We had our annual share, which is our major fundraiser in radio. We actually postponed that. We made a deliberate decision to minister to people. And we felt like our fundraiser, even though it was crucial to our financial budget, we felt like this is a time where we feel like we shouldn't be focusing on fundraising, but we should be focusing on ministry. So we took a gamble and we postponed it, which was a major thing for us. But we realized this is an opportunity to minister. Our publishing, for example, they had never done this before. They were able to pivot and create booklets in a record amount of time, sometimes 3 weeks turnaround, booklets that focused on the pandemic. I wrote a little booklet called What Now? How to Move into Your Next Season, because so many people were struggling with transition during this time. Books on anxiety, fear, pandemic. And so publishing had to throw away their normal calendar, and they had to pivot to say, how do we minister to people right now, right here? We don't have a year to prepare for this. This has struck us difficult. And I think, so we've learned we need to be nimble in times of crisis. And I tell you what, we postponed our share, which was a huge gamble.
Right.
And thought this could be a year of financial crisis. We ended up the calendar year with a record giving,
that's amazing.
A record giving. But I think in part it was because we understand that, hey, we're a ministry before we're anything. And so our call is to minister to people. And because we put people first and we prayed a lot, I think God, his favor, and people responded. And just our calendar year, December, was a record giving at Moody Bible Institute.
That's great. I mean, it's amazing how the Lord blessed that decision to go to ministry instead of and move your share. I just want to say, if you're joining us, we want to thank all of you for joining us here for the NRB Live at Lunch with Dr. Mark Jobe, president of Moody Bible Institute. And I wanted to remind you, if you joined us a little late, everyone who registered will get an email with the full webinar available there. And then also want to just let you know that Dr. Jobe is going to be a speaker at the Nrb Convention in June, June 21st through the 25th in Dallas, Texas. You'll want to start thinking about registering. This is the early bird season. You could save $200. We'd love to have you. I think we're going to have a great time just networking together, talking about Christian media and how we can further advance the gospel through all these media. Mark, I wanted to ask you this. You know, I'm someone who grew up listening to Christian radio, and it really was formative in my life. I think growing up in Chicago, listening to Moody Radio, guys like Chuck Swindoll and Dr. Erwin Lutzer and David Jeremiah were really formative for me, particularly in the high school and college years. Radio has that unique ability, I think, more than other mediums to kind of have a captive audience and really help, especially during times like this where there's so much unrest and uncertainty in the world. So just talk a little bit about the mission that Moody has to really minister to people in times of crisis. I think of, how long Moody has been around and how many different national and international crises that the ministry has seen, and how it's been there in these times to help people as they're tuning in or as they're reading one of your books, to really find hope. Explain the mission to really help people turn toward Jesus during these difficult times.
Yeah, so Moody's been around for 135 years or so, as many of you know, and of course has lived through World War I, World War II. It's lived through the just after the Chicago fire. And so there's been the Spanish flu, of course. I actually asked one of our historians if he could look up a little bit how Moody did under the Spanish flu, because, Moody was around during that time. And so it's interesting to note that, radio has a unique opportunity right now because so many people around the country, even now, are not able to attend church like they were a year ago, are not able to be a part of a small group. Many people, their social rhythm has been disrupted. Mental health professionals are saying that anxiety, tension, stress on marriages has just escalated. Suicidal ideation has been through the roof. People are very, very anxious. We have Founders Week coming up next week, and the theme is Waymaker. And the reason I came up with the theme because I was actually in the food distribution line, just going car to car, asking people how they were doing. And I came up to one car, a Hispanic young man, and I said, "How you doing physically?" He nodded. I said, emotionally and spiritually, and he just started to cry, just tears streaming down his face. And he went on to tell me how his daughter had attempted suicide and she was in the psych ward, how his wife was depressed, and how he had lost his job during the pandemic and was unemployment for a couple of months. And with tears streaming down his face in this car, he told me, I just don't see a way forward. And what struck me is that there are so many people that have been really overshadowed with this dark cloud of hopelessness. And radio has been for some, since they can't go to church, they've been able to tune in to podcasting or radio, and it provided a huge opportunity. We've got an avalanche of emails telling us I would not have survived COVID. Older people that are shut in saying, I can't go anywhere. Moody radio or listening to your program has sustained me. Or I can't go to church. I'm out of fellowship. And I'm just listening nonstop to this. And so I think we've had this incredible opportunity, and not just radio, but all online digital forms, content that is delivered to people's homes. We've had an incredible opportunity to step in like never before, actually, because of the unique circumstances, and minister to people. And so those of you that are in the radio industry and radio ministry, this has been just a phenomenal time to be able to minister to people. And we have gotten that feedback with hundreds and hundreds, maybe thousands of emails that have come our way.
Yeah, it's just a wonderful time, and we're getting some feedback, even people in our chat session talking similarly about around the world what God has been able to do through radio and TV and Christian media. This is a rich time for Christian media, a time where, when churches obviously can't meet, and there's a lot of our social gatherings that aren't happening, and where the gospel is able to go forward through all these mediums. I want to ask you a couple more questions, and then we'll probably open it up for some questions. So if any of you have questions, want to put them in the chat box there. I have a couple more questions. I've really watched the way that you're leading what's a legacy organization, Moody Bible Institute, with a rich heritage and rich legacy, but also move it into the 21st century. And what's some advice you have? I mean, I love the way that Moody is still very invested in radio, which is still a very important medium, and maybe even more so during this pandemic, but also doing a lot of stuff with digital, with podcasting, with all kinds of things. What are you thinking as a leader, as you're leading a legacy organization and trying to think through all forms of media? And what advice would you give to some of our organizations that are in that same position?
Yeah, I would say, first of all, what an extraordinary time to live in a season that is accelerating in change and creating phenomenal opportunities for the gospel. So it's a little bit nerve-wracking. We typically are more comfortable with gradual change, but we are living in a season of accelerated change. And so I would say to those of you that are leading, God has placed you in your spot, in this place for such a time as this, and you should count it an honor to be leading your organization at a time like this. The other thing I would say is I believe that every leader, some of our primary responsibilities are, one, like John Maxwell likes to say, everything rises and falls on leaders. I think it's your job to recruit, create a good leadership team. And so first of all, you need the right people. You need a good team, and you need to carefully select a team that's going to be able to think proactively. I stepped into a situation where I'm a pastor. I've never led never really wanted to lead. It was never my aspiration to be a president of a college or university. That was never on my radar. But Moody has just a tremendous opportunity to impact a lot of people. And I saw that opportunity. And so part of my job was just to recruit leaders. One of the very first guy I recruited, I knew that I needed a good, I'm a pastor, preacher, evangelist. I do ministry, and I've led a church that was big, but I needed someone that really knew organization. And so I think we should cast a bold vision and call people to join us. And so I started casting a vision, and I sat down with who was he was the president of Walgreens. And I thought he would be a great guy to be our COO. And I told someone, because he had been on the board, and they laughed at me like, he's not going to take that. That's. And so I sat down with his name is Mark Wagner. Before I even started, I said, Mark, you've been successful. You've led a huge organization, Walgreens. You could retire comfortably. But I believe that God has called you to make an impact, and I see it in you. I feel. And so would you come and help me make an impact? I'm not a business guy. You are. I need someone with your kind of savvy and understanding of organizational structures. So I said, I'm not even hired. I haven't even started my job. So I don't even know if legally I can hire you, but would you join me in making an impact for the kingdom? And him and his wife said, well, pray about it for 5 days. And 5 days later, he said, I can't get rid of this idea of making an impact for the kingdom. And so he joined me. So we started together on the first day. And then I needed a provost. We had a phenomenal provost, Dr. Perry. So I would simply say there are people around you with various skills that their greatest, deepest desire is to make an impact for the kingdom. They need someone to call it out in them. And most people don't want to be involved in just maintenance of something. They want to be involved in something that can really. And so I think it's the job of the leader to paint a preferred picture of the future and cast a bold vision of what we're trying to accomplish. And so I do think in leading an organization into the future, leaders are key. A vision that goes beyond just a 1 or 2 year. If your organization has been around for quite a while, I would encourage you to have a 5 to 10 year vision and take that seriously. Will Mancini, a shout out to Will Mancini. He's written some good stuff about vision scripts and so forth. More than ever before, I think it's important for leaders not to have just a survival mode, but we need to be thinking 5, 10 years out and asking ourselves, what does it look like? I did exercise recently where I wrote a vision script 5 years out. And so jumping 5 years in the future, if I looked around, what would I want to see in our culture? What would I want to see God do? What would we be celebrating? What would the team look like? And I think there's a power in vision in leaders, not just asking ourselves, how can we meet the next budget year, but what are we doing that is impacting the kingdom? And can we think a little bit further out there as to what God may be doing at this season as we accelerate forward? And that means change in technology, different forms. We're rapidly changing. There will always be a place for audio and visual and content. It may not look like it did 30 years ago, but we are creators of programming and content that at its heart has ministry. And so we need to think as content creators or content distributors, what are the ways that we're going to get that message out in the future?
That's a great, I love the way you frame that. And that's essentially what we're thinking through at NRB as an association of Christian communicators. We have this great message. We have creative folks. And what is the best way to do this across all the mediums where people are accessing content? we're going to have time for questions at the end, but I have a couple more myself here, and just want to thank everyone for joining us here for this NRB Live at Lunch with Dr. Mark Jobe from Moody Bible Institute. And again, if you were late, or maybe for those who registered and but were not able to make it, we're going to send an email with the full webinar here today. As you mentioned earlier, there's a lot of tensions right now in the culture and even in the church among evangelical Christians. And you have younger generations, you have older generations. They don't always see things the same way, even if they agree on the main things. You're leading a legacy institution, but you also have students that are coming in. What advice do you have for leaders to try to navigate some of these tensions, to try to help bring unity, not only within an organization, but really across the body of Christ, when it seems like we're at an all-time high in terms of disunity?
Yeah. It's definitely a challenging time to lead, because the dialogue and discourse is not, it's at a fevered pitch. And so there are trigger words and phases where people just label you into a certain camp. And so it's difficult to navigate discourses these days, because immediately people want to stereotype you, label you, and very early on. And so I would say a couple of things to leaders as one, just acknowledge that it's not just you. It's happening all across America right now. If you're a pastor, you are pastoring through one of the most volatile, difficult seasons in the history of your lifetime. And it's not just about your leadership, it's all over. So take a deep breath. This will change. Don't quit. Don't quit. A study recently said that 70% of pastors have considered alternative careers during this time. There's a lot of discouraged pastors. And because they're in the middle of a conversation that, well, pastor, you're forcing us to wear masks, and so you're shutting down the praise and capitulating to the left, or you're not making people wear masks enough, and so you're putting people at risk, or you're talking too much about race, or you're not talking enough about race, or you should be advocating more politically, or you're not advocating politically enough, and I'm leaving the church because this. So pastors are caught in a very, very difficult situation as you minister to people. And to pastors, I would say, pastors, remember, you're not politicians. You're not social commentators. You are pastors, which means that you speak into people's spiritual life. You don't have to be an expert in social issues and politics. It's not your responsibility to speak about every issue that comes our way. It's your responsibility to help people think biblically, to instruct them, to continue to teach the Word of God, and to try to do this in a way that's nonpartisan. I would also say, like I've reminded our pastors, ministering in the heart of the city of Chicago, a very, very politically charged place, I've had to remind them, I know you have various strong political views that lean to one side or the other, but you are not primarily political activists. You are not primarily social commentators. You are pastors. So if your comments tend to alienate people that we're ministering to, because of political partisanship, you need to stick with issues and the Bible and truth. That's your calling. Now, I believe there's a place for political activists. I believe there's a place for engagement in politics. I believe but as pastors, you have to choose, you have to ask yourself the question, what are you called to do? And stay in the lane of your calling.
That's great. That's great advice. That's really a good word. And hard to do in these times, but really important advice. I got one more question for you. And then we've got a few questions that have come in, and I try to ask this of everyone who's doing this NRB Live at Lunch. What is one or two books that you've read recently as a leader that have impacted you and that you'd recommend?
That's good. I have a couple sitting on my desk right now. Hey, anything from Moody Publishing is great. This doesn't happen to be a Moody Publishing. Let me see. Let me see if you can see this. This book is actually, if you're thinking about the future, I picked this up and read it recently. It's a book by Mauro Gillen. He's not a believer. It's not a Christian book, but he is a thinker out of Wharton School. And he basically talks about the trends. It's called How Today's Biggest Trends Will Collide and Reshape the Future of Everything. Easy to read, based on research and statistics. I think it's a great book for leaders that are asking, what is the next decade going to look like? It's called 2030 by Mauro Gillen. That's one book I would recommend. Let's see. The other book that I think is very interesting for pastors is called Future Church by Will Mancini, kind of getting back to discipleship as a core of what we do. The world has been highly disrupted. Churches have been highly disrupted. Our services, but our mission is the same, making disciples and sort of recapturing what we're called to be as a church, future church. I think those are the two books I'd recommend.
Thank you. And we'll try to put those in the chat here, or at least in the follow-up email, those two recommendations. Okay, we have some questions for Dr. Mark Jobe at Moody Bible Institute. We just want to thank everyone for joining us here, NRB Live at Lunch. And again, want to encourage you to sign up for our convention in June 21st through 25th in Dallas, Texas. You can save $200 if you sign up now. Dr. Jobe is going to be a keynote speaker. So we have this question that's come in. She said, I'm glad you mentioned that leaders have to communicate during crisis. And she talks about how she believes that's critical. She says, I'm curious, does the Institute have a crisis communication team? Would you recommend that? Sometimes organizations have found that helpful.
We do. We don't call it that, but we have our let's see, the guy in charge of communication and marketing are on we call it the task force team. And they are on our task force team. And so they're getting fed information about education, about publishing, about radio, about COVID statistics. And of course, we're communicating with students and parents and radio and publishing and broader audience. And so we have communicators, people in charge of communication that are on the task force team so that they're getting live feedback from multiple sources and different angles as they communicate. So one of our key leaders on the task force is Sam Choi, and he's in charge of basically our communication and marketing. And it's interesting because, you know, we also have some healthcare professionals and security and so forth, but he's on the task force and very involved in that. So I would say absolutely, they need to be in the loop of communication, and they need to be suggesting, hey, we should be communicating about this, or this is an important thing, or we need to talk about this in video form and email form. And so, yeah, communication during crisis, over communicate, emphasize over. You can't communicate enough.
That's a great question and great answer there. Guy West has a question too. He says, putting on your pastor hat, you talked about how you moved quickly to help define the view of reality for your church at the beginning of the crisis. He says, how did you do that practically? And what happens if you get behind the curve?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the church that I pastor is, so we have 27 different locations around Chicago, and we do 43 worship services. So conglomerately, we're a large church, but in practically speaking, we're like almost like a network of churches. We preach on the same topic and so forth. So we're dealing with all kinds of sizes of gatherings. So we may be dealing with 100 people or 300 or 1,500. A lot of the smaller locations were not prepared with technology. And so they just were not prepared to do a quality online service. Our larger locations, that was already happening. So it was less of a pivot. But for our smaller locations, there was a high learning curve. So I would say give yourself some grace. No one expects you to be an expert right away at being able to communicate that way. So there was a technology pivot that had to happen, which stressed a lot of the smaller pastors out a lot. I think you need to be communicating to your congregation that while the Sunday morning worship is important, we are not defined as a church by our Sunday morning. We continue to be a church like the early church in the catacombs. It couldn't really meet publicly, but was still the church. And so you have to remind the congregation that for however you do that, whether you're meeting in person or that we still are the church. We still are the church. We may not be meeting like normal in our facility, but we are the church outside of the four walls. Practically speaking, I think more than ever, it's important for your congregation to minister to some need in the community outside of the Sunday morning service. I think it's important for the congregation to be able to meet some need, take groceries to the elderly, have for Christmas or whatever. There's tons of different needs in the community right now. We've had free COVID tests at our church facility. We've distributed food. We did Christmas. I think it's more important than ever. People need to know that we as a church do more than church services. We are the Jesus people that love people in the midst of crisis. And as a pastor, I think it's important for you to say, our responsibility right now, we're not the only ones hurting. There's a world without Jesus around us that are hurting. So let's ask ourselves this question: how are we meeting the needs of the people around us? And we have a window of opportunity to do so. So how can we do that effectively?
That's a great answer. And got time, I think, for a couple more here that I have, and then we'll be finished soon. I also wanted to let everyone know that not only will you get a follow-up email with the full webinar, but we want you to join us in March, the first part of March. I believe it's March 3rd, that for our another NRB Live at Lunch. And this will be with Nona Jones from Facebook. And she does a lot of work with churches and faith-based ministries. And she can just give us a lot of help for how to do digital church and during these times. So we'll send out an email pretty soon here with information about how to register for that. Okay, a couple more questions. One, and I think this is a good one, from Harv Hendrickson. He says, media has created a lot of information. Some would say misinformation. How do you sort through and communicate with the radio audience what is true and what is not true? How do you have that kind of discernment as an organization, but obviously as a media broadcast company organization?
Yeah, Harv, that's a great question. Boy, we do have a lot of people that get into some echo chambers. And unfortunately, we have Christian people that seem to get into these extreme echo chambers. I know it's a controversial topic. I didn't realize how controversial it was, but I got the first dose of vaccine yesterday, actually. I got a shot of the vaccine, and I just happened to post a comment, hey, got my first shot of vaccine. And again, I minister in a community, a Hispanic community has been heavily hit by COVID. And so, but I had people comparing it to the mark of the beast, and just some really, and people coming up to me in the congregation asking me about just some really far out fetched ideas. And I'm like, where are you getting this stuff? So I think that it's our responsibility to lovingly, not in a partisan way, but in a pastoral way, talk people through what is extreme views, and people start listening to a lot of different things. And some people have a natural tendency towards the conspiracy theories and so forth. And so I think as pastors, I had to tell a healthcare worker who all of the job was requiring that they get a vaccine, and she's a healthcare worker, and she felt like getting a vaccine was denying her faith. And I had to just kind of sit down and I had to tell her, hey, you can work through it. If you have health concerns about it, I totally understand that. And you can talk to your health providers about your concerns about it. But don't spiritualize it, because this is if medically you're not comfortable, I understand that. But don't, chalk it up to the mark of the beast. There's no biblical support to that. And so just breathe deep. So I think in a pastoral type of way, we help clarify that which is maybe conspiracy and that which is more solid and biblical. And I think it's important to get, again, from my perspective, I try to be as nonpartisan as possible in my explanations of things and try to snatch it from the grips of partisanship, which it seems like everything gets partisan these days, and try to get it back to sort of a biblical context and understanding.
That's a great answer, and a lot of challenges for pastors out there. We're getting a lot of questions on that. Got one more question before we're finished. We just got a couple of minutes left here. I want to thank Dr. Mark Jobe from Moody Bible Institute, New Life Church, for joining us. I know he's got a busy schedule and a lot on his plate, and just thankful that he has valued our Nrb members and folks this way by giving us your time. Wayne Peterson has a great question. He says, what is the most urgent challenge right before you today?
Hey, Wayne. Wayne's a great guy. I've known Wayne for a while. Good to have you on board here. I think that the greatest challenge that we're facing right now is the greatest challenge that I think a lot of ministry and organizations are facing as well. I think it's the same challenge. We are moving into a much more secular society. I grew up in Europe, and what we're being told by the experts that study these things is that the number of people going to church is not diminishing. That's stayed about the same. The convinced and the committed is staying about the same. It's been about the same for the last 30 years. What is changing is that we used to have a group of a lot of nominal people that accepted the values of the Judeo-Christian culture. They may not have been practitioners, they may not have been believers, but they were sympathizers. That has shrunk dramatically and is rapidly shrinking. And so I think that ministries like ours have the challenge as we look at the next decade. How are we going to graciously engage in conversations with a culture that is not just neutral, but may see the church as the enemy or a bigoted minority? And so I think that we have to rethink. Evangelism may not be as front door as it has been in the past. But I think there's a lot of back doors towards evangelism that we need to think through, that Europeans and others have been practicing for a long time. I grew up in a culture which to invite someone to church was to invite them to a cult experience. And so the way we minister to people, the way we engage people, I was just telling some people recently, for example, Dr. Gary Chapman's The 5 Love Languages. It's a book that he wrote. He's an associate pastor. He's a strong believer. it's not a straight up Christian book, but it talks to marriages, and it has sold millions, and it has been a back door to evangelism and Christianity because it's meeting a front door need, but pointing to Jesus. And I think that the church and different ministries are going to have to rethink that in an increasingly post-Christian culture.
That's a great question, Wayne, and great answer from Dr. Mark Jobe. Dr. Jobe, I want to thank you so much for your time today, and we're really appreciative of your leadership at Moody Bible Institute and for your leadership within the NRB. We're grateful that you're speaking at the convention in June 21st through 25th. I want to encourage folks to register for that. And also just want a reminder to everyone who's been logged on here. We're thank you for joining us for NRB Live at Lunch. We will send a follow-up email to everyone who registered with the full webinar with some information about how to register in June and some other items of information as well. And want to have you to mark your calendars for the first week of February. I believe it's February 3rd, where we're going to have Nona Jones from Facebook, who's going to do another one of these NRB Live at Lunch things. We'll have an email out to you soon to tell you how you can register. But Dr. Jobe, thank you so much for joining us today and giving us some wisdom here.
Daniel, thank you for the ministry that you do. And again, I highly value the NRB and the ministry. That's a great ministry over so many years. And so thank you for what you do. Look forward to the convention in Texas and hope to see a lot of our listeners participate in that as well.
Well, thank you. And I want to just remind people, I think I said February 3rd for the webinar with Nona Jones, but I believe it's March 3rd. But anyways, we'll send out an email with all the right information. But thank you all for joining us today for this NRB Live at Lunch.
God bless.